One of Monster Train's most interesting features is its clan system. Unlike a lot of other deck builders, where you build your deck around one theme, or in some out of completely random cards, in Monster Train you pick a primary clan and a secondary clan, you gain the primary clan's champion and supporting cards from a secondary clan, then you combine them. Monster Train has 6 clan options: the Hellhorned, a race of demons; the Awoken, think living trees; the Stygian Guards, merfolk meets wizards, mer-wizards if you will; the Umbra, a weird faction that looks like the little soot spirits from Ghibli, except made into ravenous horrors that consume things; the Melting Remnant, people made of wax; and last but not least, the crystalline Wurmkin. Today, I wanted to go over the game's unique factions, some of the cards and playstyles they offer, along with their champions and champion upgrade paths. So if you're looking to improve your Monster Train runs, maybe find a new favorite champion, I'm going to get into the strategies that worked for me, and also make a tier list towards the end just for fun. With that said, if you feel like you need more of tips and tricks, or want to know some of the mistakes that I've made along the way, I'm going to be releasing a video on that should be out shortly after this one. Be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss it, and maybe leave a like while you're down there. But for now, let's start talking clans and clan synergies. So first up, each clan has 2 leaders, the regular and exiled. These represent different playstyles that are available within the clan. So for example, the Hellhorned, your typical demons from hell. The regular leader, or original leader, is the Hornbreaker Prince. He has 3 upgrades: Brawler, which gives pretty good stats and multi-strike; Reaper, which gives you Slay, chance to gain attack, and even better base stats, making it all round a really good choice; and Wrathful, that turns him into a high-risk, high-reward tank. My personal favorite is to actually mix multiple upgrade paths with him, combining Reaper 3 with Brawler 1 to get both high attack scaling and also multi-strike. If you have ways to improve his damage, then the 4 multi-strikes from Brawler 3 can also be quite compelling. Whereas full Reaper gives a pretty well-rounded build. Wrathful gains absurd scaling if you have some armor artifacts, but he's squishy early on and needs protection. So this is already 3 pretty well-defined paths and playstyles for the Hornbreaker Prince. And all 3 of these synergize quite well with the Hornbreaker theme of multi-striking stuff, gaining armor, and generally doing demon things. Now on the other hand, the Shardtail Queen's playstyle is completely different. She is the exiled champion of the Hornbreaker faction. Her royalty upgrade gives you attack whenever you summon more units on the same floor, which isn't bad but overall feels like the weakest upgrade path. Imperialist, on the other hand, sacrifices your imps to deal massive damage to enemies. As long as you have a way to bring them back, this can be quite a potent path. And last but not least, Imp Parade reduces the costs of imps on his floor while adding imps to your hand every turn. While there can definitely be some risks involved, personally, I prefer the Imperialist upgrade path, especially if I'm able to use Melting Remnant to summon more imps back to my hand after they die. The Shardtail Queen is quite strong, but heavily reliant on adding imp cards to your deck. So overall, I don't think she's the strongest in the game, though if you get everything rolling and have the God Draw, this deck can get insane. And by insane, I mean blowing bosses into oblivion within just a couple of rounds. Then the next faction is the Awakened, faction based on sentient tree people. The first champion is, well, the Sentient, who fills the tank role. Her upgrade paths involve gaining health, taking damage to then be healed, or just doing a lot of damage via thorns. Now personally, I found the Sentient to be very weak due to the passivity of maining a tank champion, and the poor ability to scale damage on bosses. While she is weak, her faction overall is incredibly strong, so she's still not the worst choice if you really want to start grinding out those wins. However, overall, not scaling well on bosses does feel pretty disappointing, especially when Wilden 10 is so versatile, not only being one of the best lockdown monsters, but in general having great synergy with other factions. So let's get into him. First up, his upgrade path Thornlord is overall the weakest while still being quite strong. It gives you sting cards, and allows you to scale often can't, gaining attack by casting spells. While it's not bad, and definitely synergizes with the Stygian Guard, I do feel it's behind his other 2 choices just because they're that insane. First up, Predator. Makes him quick and gives him the quick enchant, so not only will he strike first, but all units on the floor will strike first. This is a massive advantage and allows you to absolutely decimate enemy waves before they even get to act. Further upgrades enhance Wilden 10's damage and grants him multi-strike. Strangler, on the other hand, is the best way to lock down an entire floor, because not only does it give him sweep so he hits every unit, but he also gains root. Further ranks give more stats, but personally, I prefer mixing Strangler with Predator. That way, not only can he lock down everything on the floor, turning it into a kill box on either floor 1 or 3, but additionally, he also gets the option to attack and do quite a bit of damage himself. Sometimes his positioning does get a little bit awkward. I'm never quite sure if I want him to be towards the front so that he gets to attack first and deal damage, or if I want him to be towards the back so he's well protected. It generally depends on if I can get another unit that's either beefy or has something like Endless. But overall, Wilden 10 is one of my favorite champions and does an amazing job of locking things down. Then next up, we've got the Stygian Guard, starting with Tethys Titanbane. In theory, Tethys is a great spellcaster champion, but in practice, she's squishy and difficult to use. Unfortunately, I found that Soulguard's Frostbite path ends up blowing her Chillwind out of the water, and the Ice Cenobite offers comparable sweeping potential to Handheld Totem. Conduit's fine, but difficult to build around, as you need a lot of high-cost spells, but those high-cost spells will only be useful on the same floor as Tethys, meaning if she ends up dying or enemies get past her, then all your power goes away, kind of incentivizing you to stack all of your power over on the 3rd floor, wait for enemies to come to you, and kind of puts you in a situation where if your one trick doesn't work, your run's probably over. So, on the other hand, let's talk about Soulguard the Martyr. He's the tank that the Sentient wishes she could be. Cold Channel allows you to put an incredible amount of Frostbite on an enemy, and it scales to the point of being able to melt bosses, because as you cast more spells, you get more shards, and as you have more shards, you apply more Frostbite when attacked. Just make sure to heal him up, maybe pair him with an Awakened deck. Titan Channel offers some of the best base stats of any champion in the game, but at rank 3, you need a staggering 15 spells for him to become active. Yes, this is possible, especially with a Sting deck, but it's tricky to pull off, and may leave you without your strongest unit for early waves, which can be incredibly punishing on higher difficulties. Last but not least, Dire Channel has ramping damage based on spells cast. If his other upgrades weren't so strong, this might be good. And if you go Dire Channel, I do suggest one rank in Titan Channel just to keep him alive until he actually starts doing damage. But personally, I don't tend to go Dire Channel very often. Overall, my favorite path is Cold Channel with rank 2 or 3. Maybe one rank in Titan Channel for base stats if I really don't feel like I need the extra doubling of Frostbite. Being able to play a Cold Channel tank just feels really good. I can add things like health or thorns, keep him healed, do damage to enemies for healing him, and stack up hundreds and, in a couple of cases, thousands of Frostbite on foes. One thing I really like about Soulguard the Martyr is the Stygian Guard as a whole is built around casting spells, and he synergizes with this perfectly throughout every upgrade path. One thing that I feel is lacking from certain champions and upgrade paths is synergies with the mechanics presented by their clan. This is why Tethys feels so weird, and also why the Sentient doesn't quite pan out. Other cards simply do their job better, whereas Soulguard fits into his niche perfectly. Speaking of niches, we also have Penumbra, the champion of Umbra, who offers 3 distinct paths. Architect, which greatly increases floor capacity, allowing you to summon more things. Monstrous, which increases the capacity used by this champion in exchange for base stats. And Gluttonous, which has insane potential, provided you're able to gorge on morsels, but low base stats, meaning you either snowball crazily or end up dying early and not being very effective. So you can either go with an aggressive route using Gluttonous, or a support route using Architect, or just drop Monstrous and dominate a floor. Interestingly, taking something like Monstrous 2 Architect 1 is a good way to counteract the downside of Monstrous. And unlike many champions who specialize in buffing themselves up, Umbra's Exile champion Primordium specializes in being eaten. His Stalwart Snack allows him to be eaten up to 12 times. Aggressive Edible gives him more attack power to be inherited by the Eater. But the most interesting and sometimes game-breaking path is by far Superfood. When eaten, all statuses, buffs and debuffs, get inherited by the Eater. So if you give him Multi-Striker Damage Shield, then those are passed on to the unit that consume him and stack up pretty effectively so he can be eaten 3 times. Think about it this way. You play for Primordium, then you play Multi-Strike. He goes from Multi-Strike 0 to Multi-Strike 1. Now, the inheriting unit goes up to Multi-Strike 3. Though do be careful because negative effects like Ember Burn or Fragile are also inherited when eaten, meaning it's not all sunshine and roses. Though if you're worried about your units dying, consider the Melting Remnant and play Rector Flicker. This champion of the Melting Remnant offers 3 paths built around unit death. Burn Bright has solid base stats, but you have to stack his burnout before boss fights. Otherwise, well, he'll burn out too early. Accumulator is a tank who harvests enemies in exchange for gaining a little damage and a lot of life. With rank 3, he gets massive health values, and when placed on the first floor, can easily be your front line. Dark Calling, on the other hand, reforms dead allies, greatly increasing their attack. While using this path, Rector Flicker himself is pretty squishy. Protect him and turn anything else in the game into a high damage monster. This synergizes incredibly well with a lot of the other Melting Remnant units, which tend to be made to die and come back again and again. Now, I would say Rector Flicker is very powerful, but unfortunately, he pales in comparison to Little Fade, who's arguably the strongest champion in the game. Her Eternal Flame quickly snowballs attack over a few rounds, ensuring that she'll always be hitting for hundreds of damage. Because she has quick, she'll always get a hit in, and Endless means you can use her on all 3 floors, minus potentially on the last Divinity. Little Icarus gains a massive amount of spikes from slaying enemies, transforming Little Fade into the game's most unusual frontliner. She requires protection, health, or armor, but if she's able to survive, the damage output she gets is insane, because anything that dies to her thorns contributes to her slay effects, giving her more thorns and thus more damage. Last but not least, Firelight buffs all of your other units. Pair that with some reform, or maybe wickless recruitment, so that you can remove burnout, and you enhance any floor immediately. And then we have the Wurmkin faction, unique to the last Divinity, which offers 2 pretty unique champions. Starting with Spine Chief, who is all about the Wurmkin's mechanic of building up crystals on a floor and then potentially harvesting them. He also has one of my favorite playstyles, which I'll get into in just a bit. Decayer stacks Reap and turns Spine Chief into a frontline tank. This pairs well with Stygian Guard and allows you to stack massive Reaps to wipe out an entire floor. The Corruptor, on the other hand, makes him an ideal support, giving friendly units 20 attack per crystal. This is a really fun playstyle because if you get a few units that have multi-strike, it ends up being 80 damage per attack. Regular enemies get annihilated and it chews through bosses as well. Just keep those units protected. And finally, Infector is purpose-built to synergize with Extract spells, generating crystals for you to consume each turn, and unlocking some of the most powerful spell effects in the game. Alternatively, we have Echo Right, who I would describe as an acquired taste. He has 3 upgrade paths, and they're all very specific. They aren't bad, but this does make him challenging to build around, and I don't think he's great for beginners. Repeater offers high damage, coupled with the ability to return consumed spells to your hand. A lot of spells of Consume have lower costs or higher stats than their counterpart due to the once per battle nature, so this is an interesting way to take advantage of that. Shellsmith is a massive armor generator, and it makes him an excellent support class, but keep in mind he's squishy, so make sure to have those etch triggers ready when you play the champion. Last but not least, Martial Arts specializes in shell creatures. This is very difficult to build around, but allows you to summon some truly incredible cards. So now, I want to go over a quick tier list based on my personal experiences playing through. I have a big focus on reliability, and so it's not necessarily about, under the best conditions, which champion is the strongest, but which one's going to give you wins most reliably. And again, this is just my experiences playing the game for about 100 hours. If you think differently, let me know some of your tier list stuff down below after watching. So here we have a tier list. S tier means godly, incredibly reliable. F tier means good luck winning. It's not that you can't do it, but it's not going to be a good time. Anything that only has 1 upgrade path that feels viable or feels really unreliable regardless is probably going to go there. First up, Hornbreaker Prince, who I'm putting in B tier, because he's fairly reliable, but ultimately, as I was pushing my Covenant up above 15, he started to fall off. I don't want to say he's bad. In fact, I'd say B tier and C tier are kind of average. So he's average, you're going to have a pretty good time with him, but he's not the best. And I also think that while he's a very good champion for beginners to play, as you get more advanced, at least I personally, found I was gravitating towards more complex strategies rather than just Hornbreaker Prince face smash. On the other hand, Shardtail Queen, who's also in B, is in B because she's a very advanced strategy who requires specific cards. If a game doesn't offer you imps, the run is not going to be a good time. If a game does offer you imps, then it's going to be a great time. So I'm putting her in B because I actually didn't like her at first. My first couple times playing her, I would have put her in D tier, and slowly over time, that ranking has been going up as I got more experience building for her unique mechanics, especially Imperialist, because who doesn't love blowing up all your imps to blow up all your enemies? Then we have the Sentient, who is in D tier, because being a tank that doesn't do damage really isn't a great place to be, especially when there are other tanks on this list who have the ability to do damage. Again, it's not that you can't play her, I just don't particularly advise it because other champions do her job better. The only reason that she's kept out of F tier is her clan overall is so strong that you kind of get a boost to your deck just by including anything from the faction. But why'd you play the Sentient when you could instead play Wildenten, who is in A tier. He's a great all-around character that can be used either as a brawler, buffer, debuffer, or lockdown monster. He is not necessarily quite a tank, but he is still very effective in his role. And due to his versatility, I'm putting him in A tier. I feel he's definitely above average, and when combined with a strong faction, I get a lot of wins out of him. Next up, Tethys Titansbane goes in F tier. This is by far the hardest character to use, the weakest, and the most unreliable. Like I mentioned before, only Conduit felt like a really good upgrade path. Everything else, a different card does her job better, and Conduit only makes you useful on one specific floor, which really isn't a great place to be when you're trying to warp your entire deck around one playstyle. So I'm putting Tethys in F tier. Keep in mind, it's not always that you have to build around the champion within your deck, but Tethys is the unusual exception where if you take the Conduit path, you go all in or otherwise she's pretty useless. Soulguard the Martyr, on the other hand, goes in A tier. He isn't perfect reliability, but he does do the job quite well. In fact, if I can get a couple ranks of Cold Channel, maybe a rank of Titan Channel, I usually find myself pulling out a win, and sometimes I've even taken out the last Divinity. Overall, you generally want to put him towards the bottom if you're going Cold Channel. That way Frostbite has a chance to tick on each floor all the way up, whereas Titan Channel, you can put him more towards the top. Just have him smash through anything that ends up making it to your top floor. This is especially potent if you have a way to root, daze, or otherwise disable enemies who get there, giving him the extra time to deal damage. Plus, at the top floor, you have more time to cast spells, buff stuff up, and get ready, overcoming the downside of Titan Channel. Dire Channel, like I mentioned before, feels a little bit mediocre. It's okay, you can use it, but I don't particularly advise it. Then we have Penumbra, who goes down in C tier. Another character that when I was first using him, he felt really overpowered. And then I realized I could just play morsel units on anything else, and they'd also feel quite overpowered. He's not bad, he's a pretty solid all-rounder, but I don't think he really excels at anything. His faction is quite strong, and yet he's still kind of outclassed by the other option, which is the Primordium, who goes in B tier, cause Superfood is great, and the other options, while not bad, aren't overall that interesting. If I want a unit to get eaten, I'm not just going to have it get eaten 12 times and provide mediocre base stats. Sure, if you have buff spells, you can magnify that over all 12 consumptions, but most of the bosses don't last that long anyway, which makes that path hard to use. Superfood, on the other hand, provided you get things like Damage Shield, a unit with a Gorge effect, or anything like that, is incredibly good, and I love using it. But it does often warp my playstyle in a way that if Primordium doesn't come up at a good time, I can't take full advantage of him. Next up, Rector Flicker, who also goes in C tier. Not necessarily because he's bad, but because he's outshone that much by the other option, Little Fade, who I'll get into in just a moment. He is a solid champion, and if he was measured just against everything else on this list, I do think he'd be higher. He has good synergy with a Melting Remnant, and Melting Remnant is quite strong. Being able to bring back units is good, and having a frontline tank that scales is also not a bad thing. Here's the problem. Little Fade is the strongest champion in the game, and she's also the character that I use to pull out easy wins. I go, oh, I'm fighting the last Divinity here on Covenant rank. All right, time to pull out Little Fade. Let's do this. Which is why not only does she go in S tier, but Rector Flicker is bumped down to C, because ultimately you only get to choose one of them. The faction is quite good, and Little Fade is incredible. Little Icarus is a little risky. The other two are incredibly reliable, but if you get Little Icarus up and running, you're going to win that game, no doubt about it. Finally, I find the Wurmkin a little hard to use, but I do enjoy using them on occasion. So I'd put the Spine Chief in A tier, because he's got several versatile options. He pairs well with Awakened, Stygian Guard, Hellhorned, and much, much more. I especially actually like being able to use the Corruptor to give extra attacks to morsel units. Not only does it give me a disposable army that feels like Melting Remnant but better, it's also hilarious to watch morsels beat a boss to death doing 80 and 90 damage per hit. And last but not least, Echo Wright, who goes in C tier. Again, this isn't necessarily just based off of objective power. If you get the cards to make him work well, he can easily compete with a lot of the A tier champions. However, you have to get those cards, whereas everything I put in A tier kind of works out of a box, brings something to the table where even if you don't build the deck fully around that character, it's still great. You can build the character around your deck, whereas down in C tier, you have to build your deck around the character. And so, overall, that's my tier list with my thoughts. I haven't necessarily built this on just Covenant 25 runs, nor did I build this for the perspective of a player who's just starting the game and looking to progress. Instead, I tried to find a happy medium between the two. taking experiences from my own progression, especially around the Covenant 15 rank, where I was really struggling until I got good and studied the game more, while also going into a little bit of detail about why I'm doing things and what I like about each of the champions. Again, though, I'm curious, what are your rankings? Be sure to put your own tier list down in the comments below. So those are my thoughts on each champion, along with some general recommendations. But what about clans as a whole? Where do I rank them? Well, Awoken I put as the best supporting clan and one of the best primary clans. Not only is Root Seed an incredibly good spell, but you get sweepers, multi-strike, and quick. Healing effects are great, and having more draw is always an advantage. Root Seeds is a perfect way to snowball many units and synergizes super well with multi-strike. Also with sweep, it's a damage magnifier plus base damage. So not only does this feel like it's the best supporting faction, but it just has access to really good mechanics. Now, number 2, I would put Stygian Guard, where you get Frozen Lance or Foregone Power. Both of these cards are pretty mediocre, but the units themselves, and especially their incant effects, are very good. Not only that, but they have some of the best spells in the game. Overall, this felt like a pretty close tier with Hellhorned, as it has a wide variety of supported strategies. And overall, the reason I'm putting Stygian ahead is I just feel like there's more uses for them because they have that flexibility between creatures and spells. Next up, my third recommendation is Hellhorned. Torch is pretty good for targeted damage, and Queen's Impling is good for general DPS. Hellhorned also have a lot of powerful units, along with multi-strike, slay, and armor. Their spells are pretty good at dealing with backline enemies, and AoE damage is always nice. Like with Stygian, they do feel like they're just a little bit behind Awoken. That faction's just so packed with strong mechanics. But overall, if I said that this was rank 2 and Stygian was 3, or vice versa, I don't think much really changes. They're incredibly strong and very close to each other in power level. Next up, my fourth recommendation is Umbra, with Shade Splitter and Plink. Why? Well, it's strong, but a little bit more difficult to use. Morsel units are powerful, but require lots of extra space, and therefore this does have fairly poor synergy with strategies focused around spells or very bulky units. On one hand, it does give space, allowing you to do things like overstack, but on the other hand, it feels a little bit more difficult to use, a little less reliable, and sometimes innately punished by certain enemy mechanics like sweep. Then at number 5, we have Melting Remnant, offering Dreg and Primitive Mold. If this faction synergizes well with your deck, it's incredibly good. But the main idea behind Melting Remnant is disposable units, and Umbra does that as well, so there's quite a bit of competition in the niche, especially as a supporting faction. And it often requires additional investment. Now, if you're using this as your primary faction, it's up there with the best, things like Awoken. But if you're using it as a secondary faction and it can't get carried by Little Fade, I would say only take it if you think it's going to work well with your strategy, i.e. Melting Remnant plus Hellhorned doesn't go very well from my experience. Nor does Melting Remnant plus Umbra. On the other hand, Melting Remnant plus Wurmkin or Melting Remnant plus Stygian Guard can go quite well. And there are some exceptions there, like Melting Remnant as a secondary, supporting a Hellhorned with Shardtail Queen does actually work because that way you get to resurrect your Implings to bluff them up to resurrect them again. And then my last recommendation is Wurmkin, who offers Fracture and Echo Break. I don't really think Wurmkin is a great supporting faction because it builds up power on a per floor basis and feels heavily restrictive. It's definitely quite good for floor 3 strategies, but I also struggle to make it work. More often than not, when I take Wurmkin, it's as a primary faction, not a secondary. And even then, I do find that a lot of my Wurmkin runs are less reliable than those with the other factions. Again, while I'm ranking these from 1 to 6, they're all incredibly close and definitely all viable. Ultimately, it comes down more to your personal strategy and your taste for RNG. While skill is often the determining factor by the end of a run, RNG can be a heavy factor in the beginning. So those are the champions and clans available in Monster Train, and just some of my thoughts on which is the best. But be sure to experiment for yourself, find paths you enjoy, try some challenges, and think out of a box, because there's absolutely a lot of strong options. And so now I'm curious, what's your favorite, and what's the highest Covenant rank that you've used to defeat them? Or have you managed to defeat the hallowed Covenant 25 on every single champion? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. Now, if you're looking for more content, I have a full review of Monster Train. If you've somehow gotten this far without actually knowing what the game is, definitely check it out after this. Or if you're looking for some other similar games, consider Slave Aspire, a title that I think inspired a lot of Monster Train. Loop Hero, something that brings very similar deck mechanics, or Hades, one of the best roguelikes I've ever played. With that said, before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. If you want to see more videos like this, supporting on Patreon and letting me know you want to see more of this is one of the best ways to ensure content like this gets made. Because right now this channel isn't monetized, so I only get to do it as a hobby when I have spare time. But with that said, thanks for watching, I'm glad you made it to the end, and I hope this helps on your Monster Train journey. If you're looking for some tips and tricks on how to progress, that video should be coming out soon, and if it's already out, I'll try to remember to put it down below. Thanks again, and I hope to see you sometime soon.